Welcome to the School of Bravery podcast. My name is Emily Ann Peterson, and this is Amber Hawken. Say hi, Amber.
Hey. Hello, hello.
So Amber is awesome. I interviewed her a couple times before for the Bare Naked Bravery podcast, but I wanted to have her back on because this upcoming month is the theme of honesty. And we just came out of the theme of friction, and we're going into honesty, which some people might say are the same thing. Or being honest can have a lot of friction attached to it. And I know that Amber is just an expert at all things honest, because I see that in her all the time. So I want to have her on. But Amber, go ahead and give a little brief overview of what you're doing and working on these days before we jump into the.
Sure. Well, to be perfectly honest, there's a lot going on and there's a lot of moving parts, but to be brief, I'm kind of split into, as far as creatively, I have my Amber Hawken stuff and I run retreats and I do one-on-one work with that, talk a lot of shit on my videos and stuff about the brain and life and reality and consciousness and evolution of our soul and psychotherapy and trauma healing and that kind of jazz. And then my other half is, it seems very different, but it's really the same basis, but it's called Calm Mind Project. And we started by teaching emotional intelligence and resilience in schools through mindfulness, meditation, and self-awareness, because working with the adults long enough made me kind of question, well, how can I put myself out of a job here? Why don't I work with the kids so we can prevent and help us evolve in a different way so we can save the world, So we do that, but we expand into the public as well, because the mind is such a beautiful tool, but we need to learn how to use it. So, yeah.
So with all of that work, how have you seen honesty play a role in someone's progress? We'll say their progress of their evolution, their personal evolution.
The first thing that comes to mind is really understanding probably what holds us back, which it's no secret. We all know it's fear, but what is fear exactly? Fear is, a lot of the time when we think about fear, we instantly have an image or a mental association with the feeling that we associate with fear. Now, your feeling is completely different to my feeling, but we're both afraid of it. So we tend to, as human beings, be afraid of the idea of fear, not fear itself, right? So to answer your question, when it comes to honesty and progress, because we all have a fear, we all have a sense of who we are, right? Let's start there. Let me start at the beginning. When we're born, you don't know you're Emily Ann Peterson. You don't identify as anything. You don't identify with anything at all. When I say identify, it's to think you are. I often say that, people are like, what does that mean? So if I was to identify with my keep cup, I'd think I was the keep cup. We identify with nothing when we're born. We develop this sense of identity of who I am. And we ask the big questions on a primitive level. What is it to be enough? What is it to be loved? Because our amygdala is asking these questions because we need to survive. So we form this sense of self, me. This is me. This is who I am. And I've learned when I do this behavior, or I say this thing, or I don't do this thing, I'll get love. I will get affection. I will get support. I will, whatever it is, right? We develop this sense of who we are. And then the map of the world, right? In America, your map of the world of what right and wrong is, and good and bad, and love and hate, very different to everyone else in the world. Hence, there's some argument about a wall and some stuff like that, right? So
I'm very embarrassed by that fact that is the case in our country. But I'm also really grateful to have work that expands beyond our borders, because
to be perfectly honest, I think America, and this is like everything, when we look at someone, I know we're branching off here, but I think this is important. I promise I will come back.
This is part of the deal, because being honest about the reality the reality of someone who lives in the United States is very different in an honest kind of way. It's very different than somebody who lives in Australia or Greece or Israel or the UK. There are very different honest realities.
Totally. And if I'm to say right now, look, let's be honest. I'm not saying what's really honest and in a sense that what is honesty? And I think that that's the biggest question right here. And I really want to circle back to the honesty in our own identity, because I think it's important in the creative process. But it's really good to go there, because if we're talking about, well, what is honesty? And if I say, well, let's be honest, all I'm doing is giving my opinion. Like, honesty is relative. And then there is a sense when we're looking at a someone who comes to mind now is Glennon Doyle, right? And she's talking about what she feels is honest and what needs to be said. And that's incredible. And in a sense, we've spoken about anger in the past and how anger can be something that's very productive if we put it into passion, if we put it into change. But if anger turns into judgment about right or wrong, then it fucks us up. Can I say fuck? I said fuck, sorry.
Yep.
Cool. So because it and the reason it causes friction, and not because I think that there's a friction that is progressive and then a friction that's not progressive. Like, we can have friction, but if the friction creates more tension, more judgment, then you're rippling towards the regression or de-evolution, or you're just going back into fear. Whereas if we can use the friction that we feel, which we can use as anger produced by honesty, then we can use it to change. So I guess if we're ever going to say the statement like, let's be honest here, then while you're saying it, express yourself, but simultaneously be open to that creating change in your own mind as well. Right. Because, so let's go back to our own sense of identity, right? And honesty. Yeah. If we're wanting, and where I'm going with this is like our fear around honesty, our fear around being honest. Why do we fear being honest? And the reason is because once we've created this sense of identity of who we are as a human being, because what I truly believe is that we have an innate essence that's it's the same kind of intelligence that a flower has, right? How does a flower know to grow into a flower? When it's a seed, if you have a seed, a sunflower seed, how does that sunflower seed know to grow into a sunflower? Like, how does it know that? And if you ask anyone the question, they'll be like, I don't know, it just knows. It's coded. Yeah, but where's the coding from? Like, where did it come from? I don't know. And people will be like, and they'll get to this kind of mind-blowing thing that they realize it comes from somewhere that we can't really explain. It's an innate intelligence. Cool. You have that. I have that. We all get that. It's science. I guess we can't really measure innate intelligence. There's not like a measurement like kilometers or miles for it, but we feel it. We know it because we can see it. So it is real. So there's an innate intelligence. We've got that, but we've also got this sense of me and I. They're separate. They're different. The me and the I has built itself. It didn't actually exist when we were born. It's something we created. It's something we hold on to, and it's actually creates the experience of life. It creates all these filters. As an example, and using America again, but depending on where you are situated in the USA, right? Where you are on the borders of USA, even if you're north or south or east or west, will very much determine how you've seen the world, whether or not you think there should be a wall, there shouldn't be a wall, and your reason behind that.
Right. It
is all literally just a filter. If we were to remove all of these different filters, and if you're a bit like me and you're from Australia and you're watching this, you're like, this is a fucking circus. What is even happening?
Yeah.
But I'm also not very politically engaged. I'm kind of like, seems like a lot of effort, but I'm really, 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 part of me is like, maybe what I could do is actually engage a little bit more to learn things around social change that would help the betterment of our world. Because I think being politically involved like that, I think you do that very well. I'm just not like that, not because of any particular reason. It's just like,
what you're getting at is basically like, who am I without the baseball hat that I have on my head? Who am I without the car that I drive? Who am I without the job that I have? Who am I without the family that I grew up in? Who am I without the genetics that I have deep in the amygdala, like ancestry, like, who am I without all of those things?
Right. And if we're going to use honesty and friction, and we're talking about like what is honesty and how does it prevent progression, the reason that we fear honesty, it's not that we actually fear honesty, it's that we perceive, it's that we actually fear the feeling of fear, or the perceived feeling of fear. We're like, well, if I'm going to be honest, then I'm going to be vulnerable. Honesty and vulnerable, as I know that you teach, it's a sub, right?
Yeah. Honesty is a sub ingredient of vulnerability.
Right. And it's like, to be vulnerable, you need to be honest. And to be honest means I'm being vulnerable, which is to open up. And the only part of us that is afraid of that vulnerability is this imagined sense of self. So if we're not honest, then we're not willing to challenge that imagined sense of self. And the reason that limits progression is because that imagined sense of self sees the world only one way. And if you want to progress and evolve in your life, you have to be willing to tear down that imagined sense of self entirely, to tear away all these ideas about who I am. Like, progression is not about adding things on, it's about taking away what's not real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we've got to be honest to tear that down, right?
It's really interesting what in the masterclass that we just did on how to bounce back from down days. One of the things that I came to in the class prep was, changing my lifestyle from a traditional, like, consumeristic lifestyle to a minimalist lifestyle has been a large part of helping me to be so resilient after having down days, because all of the clutter, like mental clutter, physical clutter, visual clutter, was part of the unnecessary friction that was keeping me from bouncing back after I had kind of a low day or an off day, or whatever you want to call it. So
I love that.
It makes perfect sense to me that in order for us to be perfectly honest and like free and open and without that kind of friction of fear, that we would have to get even more minimal. And
absolutely
not small minimal, but just like essential minimal.
Down to what it really is. And it's funny you talk about minimalism. I just did 2.5 weeks touring New Zealand in a van with just 7 kilograms. I was like, I'm not paying for like, I don't need baggage. Like, the flights were really inexpensive because it was around Christmas, and my partner and I were like, let's just do carry on. And it's New Zealand, it's freezing. Like, even though it's summer, it's freezing. Like, you need many, many layers, and that shit's heavy. You need shoes, and we were hiking. And I got home and we moved place, of course, because you know what that's like. That's the life. And I looked at my things. I was like, I have too many things. I just went to New Zealand with 7 kilograms, and I didn't even use it all. Like, I didn't even need it. And so it's kind of going back to, and let's relate that back to about progress. It's like, well, what do we really need? And even asking the question, taking that to the next level, what do we really need to be enough? Which almost answers, it's like, okay, well, let's answer that question. What if we can answer that question? What is it to be enough? What is it to be enough? If we were to, and I use this with my clients, and I say to them, when they're having worthiness stuff or enoughness stuff or fear around moving forward and progress and action and creativity, well, what is enoughness? How do you know that you're enough? How do you know that your work's enough? How do you know blah, blah, blah? And we'll get down to it and I'll go, cool. If you were holding a newborn baby and you had to educate them on life about what, you're going to instruct them, these are the 1, 2, 3 steps to be enough, what would it be? And they'd be like, no, nothing. No, they are enough just because they are. I was like, cool. What's the difference between you and the baby? Nothing. Right. Your ideas.
Right.
So if we talk about enoughness and stripping it back, what is enough? It's like just being. And I think that that's a really cool, important thing to remember around honesty. It's like, what if we could use honesty and friction to progress towards our higher self? Is that too deep?
No, of course not. First of all. But just to reiterate, what if we could use friction and honesty to progress into our higher selves? So when I apply that to like a business realm kind of thing, what I do with this is I am super sensitive to friction in my day-to-day life because I've built up that sensitivity.
Yeah.
So when I encounter, like, say, for instance, somebody is having troubleshooting issues logging into the School of Bravery site, that's friction. And and it helps me to be honest about the fact that that is friction and unnecessary friction. By then I can do something about it later. I can either remove the friction or make it smoother or eliminate it completely. So I mean, that's how I see that playing out in a business and career and creative realm, is that, like, if you are building a sensitivity to the friction and you're willing to be honest about how that friction affects the rest of things.
Absolutely. And I guess that I think we sometimes have the habit as human beings to pull back from friction. It's a habit because it's painful. So our amygdala says, that hurts, let me pull back. So just like fear can sometimes guide us towards these things, friction in your business or in your everyday life, just like you were saying, can guide us to making things. It's not even more about efficiency so you can do more because it's going to be better, but as in because it removes the noise of what's not necessarily. And then if we relate, because let's be honest, if you're running your own business, it's going to be related to something higher within you. So removing friction out of your business is removing friction for your higher good of everything. So it's all intertwined. Friction, honesty. So the more honest we can be with ourselves and opening up to friction instead of closing down and thinking we need to close down to honesty. Or what about honest feedback, like we were talking about earlier?
Before we started recording, we were talking about feedback loops and how you have to pick your people and your boundaries when you're sharing creative ideas and seeking feedback and things like that. So, and I think that that's part of the deal, is that if you build up a sensitivity to friction, then when you encounter a creative feedback situation and you encounter or you walk into a creative feedback situation and you encounter friction, either emotional friction or relational friction or whatever, then the existence of that friction can be a helper for guiding you to take the next step rather than just, unabashed making a scary decision later on.
Exactly. So it's like, what do we do with friction? Cool. And what you said before, you built up a sensitivity to friction. Do you mean as in, what did you mean by that?
Well, good question. So I think that the existence of friction by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And so because of that, whenever I encounter it, I don't have emotional reactions to it.
Right.
Because I acknowledge that my emotional reactions to the friction might also be friction.
It is.
Right. And so by separating the existence of that friction by itself, I'm able to get a more honest look at how to take the next step forward.
Right. If we get caught up in the friction itself, resist the friction, we've created more friction. Whereas if we can initially see the friction for what it is, step back, and that's really emotional intelligence, right?
Oh yeah.
So friction is energy. Energy is that emotional reaction. I don't mind sharing. Shall I share what I spoke to you earlier about creative friction?
You can if you'd like. Yeah. The only other thing I was going to say is that, well, now I've forgotten it. So go ahead and share it.
Because I think if you're a human being, you're going to come up against creative friction or sharing friction.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, well, how can we build a tolerance to friction or use friction for the better? And so this was an example where I was sharing with Emily how I was sharing with my partner part of a creative where I was in the stage of a creative process where I'm a verbal diarrhea, get it out, talk it out when I'm at a block. And my partner's like, let's fix the problem. And so.
And for you, fixing the problem is fixed by the continual discussion of the problem,
Right.
not by rolling up your sleeves and fixing the loose screws somewhere. Yeah.
Well, I'm not there yet.
Right.
I'm not there yet. So I think the question here in my head is, if there's friction, or if you find that talking to certain people is creating friction, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but perhaps you can be mindful about what's helpful friction and what's not helpful friction. And what about our reactions to friction? Because that's going to determine whether we grow or shrink.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think knowing yourself and where you're at, knowing what you want and where you're going, will help you understand. Because even though I was talking about a creative business idea, whenever we're in life, we're creating, in a sense. We're always creating our next reality, mm-hmm. and stripping back what needs to be there. So friction can always and will always be present where there's an area of growth. But it's kind of like looking at the difference between fear and intuition. Sometimes that friction is there because of where you're at in yourself, of what you're trying to be honest about. Mm-hmm. Are you trying to be honest about, if we look at honesty as like reality, it's like, this is our current reality. So if you're trying to be honest about figuring out a problem, then trying to go into verbal diarrhea is obviously it's not going to help you. That kind of friction, not helpful. But if you're going to be going towards a space where you're going through the process in your life, whether it's a creative business idea or if it's just something like, it's the nature of the feminine energy, is that swirling. If you're there, we can create more friction by going into problem solving. Mm-hmm, so it's almost like looking at the seasons of creativity, looking at the seasons of these different things, and honesty in a sense I'm kind of watching this image in my head unfold of like the masculine and the feminine and the flower and the intelligence of the flower. And it's like that in its sense has the beauty of shifting reality, which is what honesty is, and watching that progress in a sense.
Yeah. I'm excited because your guest expert training is on how to tell the difference between fear and intuition, which I think is this next step. Now that you recognize that friction exists, a lot of times fear is the friction. Mm-hmm. And sometimes if you don't know the difference between that fear and your intuition telling you to do something or not do something, your reaction to the friction can get a little jumbly, and you totally tend to avoid the friction, which has a bunch of other problems that we don't need to go into. But I'm excited for you to do that. So if you are a current student of the School of Bravery, then you get access to Amber Hawken's guest expert training in your student area. And if you're not a student, then we would love to have you. You can go to schoolofbravery.com and find out all the information there. And enrollment is, right now, it's as low as $25 a month. So, and that includes master classes and all the guest expert trainings and a bunch of other good stuff too. So we'd love to have you there. And go check out Amber Hawken's stuff, like her podcast, the Calm Mind Project. All of her links and everything is going to be below in the notes and the caption.
The stuff down there.
And Amber, I just love talking with you. I'm so honored to have a friend like you all the way across the world.
Right back at you. I love it.
Yeah.